girls. Happy Wednesday. It's Wednesday. It's hard to keep track these days. We're going to continue reading in our Frog and Toad, our friends book. We're going to read the next 2 chapters today. We're going to do a double one because I have one activity that you could pick either chapter to do with. I hope you had fun writing about your best friend. Erin, who did you write about?
Freya.
And what were 3 reasons why you like your friend Freya?
Because she's funny and because she walks by her house a lot. And
I think we practiced writing the word nice, right? Wasn't that your third?
She's nice.
Yeah, she's nice. The next story in Frog and Toad is called The Story.
Hey, we're reading a story.
What a coincidence. It's called The Story.
I know why.
One summer day. Oh, so we started, where were the friends in the last chapter that we read? Was
Spring.
It was spring. Good. Augie's over there folding his laundry, so that's why he's not over here right now. But it was spring, and now we've moved on to summer, which is exactly why Augie's folding clothes, because we switched out our spring clothes to our summer clothes so that we can have our shorts available, right? Yep. There it is. So Augie's still working on his work. All right, one day in summer, Frog was not feeling well. Oh no, thank goodness they don't have the corona in this. Toad said, "Frog, you're looking quite green." Frogs are always green. "But I always look green," said Frog. "I am a frog. Today you look very green, even for a frog," said Toad. "Get into bed and rest." Toad made Frog a cup of hot tea. Frog drank the tea and then said, "Tell me a story while I'm resting." What a good friend.
Yep.
"All right," said Toad. "Let me think of a story to tell you." Toad thought and couldn't think of a story to tell Frog. "I'll go out on the front porch and walk up and down," said Toad. "Perhaps that will help me think of a story." Toad walked up and down on the porch for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Oh, poor Toad, he's stuck.
But
Never
he doesn't
felt
mean like walking up walls, he means like back and forth.
Back and forth, yes. Have you ever been stuck when Mrs. Sullivan says, "It's time for writing, you can have a free write, you can write about whatever you want"? Have you ever went, "I have nothing to write about"?
Not me.
Oh, you always have ideas. Then Toad went into the house and stood on his head. On his head? "Why are you standing on your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I stand on my head, it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad stood on his head for a long time, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Oh boy. That's actually the same picture that's on the back of the book. Then Toad poured a glass of water over his head. "Why are you pouring water over your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I pour water over my head, it will help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. Oh boy.
Here we go again.
Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. "Why are you banging your head against the wall?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I bang my head against the wall hard enough, it will help me to think of a story," said Toad.
Don't get a concussion.
Right? Poor choice.
Heaven.
"I am feeling much better now, Toad," said Frog. "I do not think I need a story anymore." "Then you get out of bed and let me get into it," said Toad, "because now I feel terrible." Frog said, "Would you like me to tell you a story, Toad?" "Yes," said Toad, "if you know one."
I know what she does.
"Once upon a time," said Frog, "there were 2 good friends, a frog and a toad. Frog was not feeling well. He asked his friend Toad to tell him a story. He couldn't think of a story. He walked up and down on the porch, but he couldn't think of a story. He stood on his head, and he couldn't think of a story. He poured water over his head, couldn't think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but still could not think of a story. Then the toad did not feel well, so the frog was feeling better. So Toad went to bed, and Frog got up and told him a story. The end. "How was that, Toad?" asked Frog. But Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep.
I thought he was gonna say, Toad?
That's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is called The Lost Button. We're going to read that one next. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked into the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." Have you ever lost a button? I've lost buttons before.
I have.
"Don't worry," said Frog. "We'll go back to all the places that we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look at the button in the tall grass. "Here's your button," cried Frog. "That's not my button," said Toad. "My button is black." "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the button into his pocket. So they went back to the meadow. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button? I found one." Sparrow was the second one. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes, and my button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes into his pocket. They went back into the woods and looked on the dark path. "Here is your button," said Frog. Here's the third button. "That is not my button," cried Toad. "That button is small. My button is big." Toad put the small button into his pocket. There he is with number 2, Sparrow. And there he is with the third button with Frog. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. "I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here is one that I just found." So this is the 4th button. "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button is round." Toad put the square button into his pocket.
That's not even a button.
Buttons can be square.
What?
Buttons can be hexagons.
I thought
Buttons
they
can
were
be
just
octagons.
round.
Buttons can be all different types of things. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here is your button." 5th button, said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin and my button is thick."
Wow, he's complaining badly.
Not being so kind to all these people that are trying to help him find a button. Toad put the thin button into his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed. What could he do to feel better so that he's not making such a ruckus?
Count to 10.
Count to 10. Good strategy.
Do the.
No.
Take 5.
Yeah, 5. That's
Take 5. Any other good strategies?
Flower hands.
Flower hands. All these good calming strategies because he's feeling like he's in the red zone.
Meditation.
Meditation, deep breaths, some mindfulness. Absolutely.
yoga.
He was jumping up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor, he saw a white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here the whole time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." There he is when he's having his red zone fit. And there he is when he gets home and sees his button was at home the whole time.
It was a little problem.
Toad took all the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well.
Better than the other people who made that jacket.
There he is with the button jacket. All right, we're going to save the next chapter for tomorrow. Here's your challenge. We're going to do some sequencing. Both of those stories were really good for sequencing. The first chapter, when they were telling the story, Toad did 4 things. Toad, if I look back at my book, and you might have to rewind the video to rehear things, and that's okay. Or if you have the story at home, you can look at it. First, he went out on the patio and he paced back and forth, then back and forth. Then, what did he do?
Jumped on his head.
Stood on his head. Then what did he do?
Poured a glass of water on his head.
Poured water all over his head. And what's the last thing he did? Do you remember?
Yeah, banged his head against the wall.
He banged his head against the wall. You could sequence that story by drawing 4 pictures in the right order. So you'd have to start with first, Frog paced back and forth, which means walked back and forth. Next, he
Toad.
stood on his head. Toad stood on his head. Then Toad put water on his head. And then last, Toad banged his head against the wall. You could draw 4 pictures if you wanted to.
And then
You could even cut them out and then reorder them and then give yourself a quiz to see if you can put them in the right order.
well.
Then he didn't feel well. If you wanted to add that one on, you could. For the button story, there was 5 parts. I want you to sequence the 5 buttons that he saw, okay? When they were hunting. So the first one, Frog found in the meadow for him. The next one, the Sparrow gave to him. The third one was when they were in the woods. Frog showed him one in the woods. The fourth one came from the raccoon. And the 5th one was again Frog gave it to him from the river. So it was Frog in the meadow. Then it was the Sparrow. Then it was Frog in the woods. Then it was the raccoon. Then it was Frog at the river. So there was 5 different pictures for that one.
River twice. I heard you say river.
Let me rephrase. Frog in the meadow. Then it was the Sparrow. Frog in the woods. Then it was the raccoon. Then it was Frog at the river. Okay? Draw a picture of each one of those pieces of the story, and then you can cut them out, mix them up, and give yourself a little quiz to see if you can put the story back in the right order and sequence that story. Okay? You can pick whether you do the button or the story. I think both of those are really good sequencing stories. Okay? Have fun drawing and cutting and pasting and putting them in order, and I will see you back tomorrow. Bye!